Good evening and welcome to Northshire Bookstore. My name is Davith Wood. I'm the events manager here at the Northshire's Manchester, Vermont location. Before we get started, a couple of quick notes. You can type questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any point this evening. I'll save those up and pose them for you during the Q&A at the end of the event. And secondly, a note of thanks. Independent bookselling is it's a hard job in the best of times. So over the last 2 years, we really do owe our existence to your continued support. So thank you very much. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight Rachel Feltman, author of Been There, Done That, A Rousing History of Sex. Rachel Feltman is the executive editor of Popular Science and hosts pop-sized podcast, The Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week. In 2014, Feltman founded the Washington Post's Speaking of Science blog, known for headlines like, "You probably have herpes, but that's really okay," and "Uranus might be full of surprises." Feltman studied environmental science at Simon's Rock and has a master's in science reporting from NYU. Her first paying gig was organizing a bookshelf full of textbooks on vulvar disease at the age of 7, and she's never looked back. Her new book, Been There, Done That, which you can order from Northshire at the link now in the comments, has been called a boisterous naked romp through the rainforest of human sexuality, a lovably bonkers book, both empathetic and relentlessly entertaining, and an irreverent invitation to be enchanted by one's body, rather than ashamed, to be present in desire, rather than dislocated from it, to cast off the veil of insecurity and embrace one's whole self. And we are lucky that she'll be joined by Leigh Cowart. They are a researcher and journalist whose work has appeared in the Washington Post, New York Magazine, BuzzFeed News, Long Reads, Vice, and elsewhere. Before becoming a journalist, Cowart was an academic doing research on subjects like sexual dimorphism in leaf-nosed bats and resource allocation in flowers. They are the author of Hurts So Good, The Science and Culture of Pain on Purpose, which was featured in the New York Times, NPR, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, and elsewhere. Please join me in welcoming Leigh Cowart and Rachel Feltman to Northshire Bookstore.
Hello.
Hi, thank you.
Rachel, I am so excited to be here with you to talk about your book. For the people at home, Rachel has been my editor off and on over the years for a variety of different publications and is just one of the best. And I'm so excited that your book is out and I get to talk to you about it. It's so good and congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Something I really love about your work is the way that you are so good at making me feel like you're letting me in on a wonderful secret. There is a joy of discovery in your writing, and it feels like you are excited to share it with me. And I think that that is a precious and wonderful thing in the world of science communication. Your book has had me just shouting facts across my house the whole time I read it, just furiously sending texts to people with no context about what I'm learning about. So for that, I thank you and congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, that is exactly how I want my books to be read. And yeah, thank you so much for doing this, Leigh. I, as you know, am a very big fan of your work, and I cannot think of anyone better to talk about weird sex facts with. So
yes, everything I've always wanted to hear. So let's get into a little bit to the kind of underlying thesis of your book, and before we get into a reading. But I love that it really focuses on, in part, how humans love to make categories to understand our world, but how that desire to categorize and make sense of things has led to some false binaries and maybe inaccurate, quote, cultural norms. And could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I've been thinking about as kind of a meta narrative as a science communicator for a few years now. And it's funny because it was actually a story about sex in a way that got me really thinking about that. A few years ago, we covered at PopSci a study about this so-called species of salamanders. I talked about them briefly in the book, and they use a reproductive strategy called kleptogenesis, which is such a great word. And they really are a great example of how poor our definition of what a species is. They only share mitochondrial DNA, which is, of course, the small parcel passed down by the mother through generations, and they steal genes from males of a bunch of different related salamander species, and they just kind of like collect genetic material, and then when it's time to reproduce, they can undergo parthenogenesis, essentially, not use any of the male material, or they can take bits and pieces of it. And I think they've been recorded using up to 5 different male genomes in creating their offspring. So you have this species that's defined by like negative space. Like they what they have in common is that they have this tactic of recombining their genes, all the time, sometimes from one, pregnancy to another, or, egg laying rather. And so that got me thinking about, and a lot of scientists and science journalists talking about the idea of the categories we draw around different species, and how fundamentally flawed a lot of our simpler definitions of species proved to be once we started breeding more hybrids in captivity. And then once we started studying DNA, and then once we started studying the evolution of ancient DNA, and just kind of the more we learn, the more the very tight categories we made, like what most of us learned in grade school, that a species are the 2 organisms can mate and reproduce and have fertile offspring together. That just has really fallen apart. And it doesn't mean it's not mostly true. Otherwise, we wouldn't have come up with it. It's like pretty close, but it's just not the whole story. And I started reading a lot of very heady philosophical books about biological sex, gender, really amazing stuff written by people much smarter than me, but probably too dense for most people to want to pick up and read. And I started feeling like there was a lot of similarity between the way our idea of what a species is has evolved and the way our concept of sex should be evolving. Because the more we learn, the more we see exceptions to the idea of a strict sexual binary. And it doesn't mean like the buckets that we created are so completely off base. There's a reason we came up with those buckets, because if you were gonna just draw a line straight down the middle, that is where you would draw that line. But it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. There's more going on than that. It's more complicated, like so many things in biology and other areas of science. So that was very long-winded background for that. But, we know, it's a very well-known psychological phenomenon that humans really like to categorize things. We love knowing what's us and what's them. We love knowing what's in and what's out. We don't want our, we don't want to see blood on the outside of our bodies generally, because that's a dangerous thing. We don't want to, we want to know what a friend looks like and what a predator looks like. We want to know what good food looks like versus poison. And our love of doing that innately, and the little like surge of satisfaction we get at being like, oh yes, everything in its right place, and I definitely won't accidentally eat poison berries today, really leads us to get very comfortable in these categories we create. And one point I really tried to make in the book is that it's actually, not very scientific to be really affronted by the idea that maybe some of these categories are not right, because we're always getting new information, and it happened with species, and I think it's also happening with sexes, which is exciting.
I I get the sense that a lot of people kind of develop some anxiety around the ambiguity of something that is not immediately categorizable. Um, and I'm wondering what you think a good counter to that is. Like, how do you overcome that initial, like for people who struggle with letting go of a specific category or seeing it as like part of a broader situation, like what steps can people take to maybe be more curious or be more open to it?
Totally. That is such a great question. And I think, that the answer is to be more curious. And I guess, how to become more curious. I think it's so important in everything that humans like take a beat to sit with their discomfort and ask where it's coming from, which, isn't a perfect solution. It's work. It's a lot of work. But I think when you really make a practice of being like, oh, am I learning something new right now? And enjoying that when it's a joyful, low stakes situation, but also being willing to like sit in the discomfort when you're like, oh, am I learning something new right now that might really rock my worldview? It's, I think it's like anything else when it comes to overcoming sort of our innate biases and like the ways that our lizard brain sometimes does not serve us. It's often just like the best you can do is really think about like, why is this information making me uncomfortable? Is there a more compassionate and curious way for me to digest this information? And then also just, I think a big thing that I try to get at in the book is that even if you don't get it, like all you should care about is not hurting other people. And I know that we have a lot of societal pressure that is actually encouraging us to be quite not kind to other people. But I feel like most people, if you presented to them, like, don't you want to be kind to like not hurt people? Don't you want to not cause people harm? Most people would probably say, yes, I don't want to cause other people harm. And I think, a lot of people, especially, I think in the US right now, have not like done enough sitting with their discomfort and thinking about whether it's worth them causing other people harm to refuse to be uncomfortable,
Going back to compassion and the role that plays in this kind of science communication, this kind of education, I'm finding your book to be very compassionate and inclusive. And I'm wondering if you can talk about like the choices that led you to do that and what the process was of making this information available to people in this way.
Yeah, I think I've always, as a science communicator, wanted to engage with people with humor and kind of try to delight them and shock them and make them like see wonder where they didn't expect it, whether that's like thinking about the awe of the universe or like, wow, there's a lot of science in poop. Like, everybody does it. And now apparently there's millions of dollars of research going into it. Those things always shock people and get their attention. So that was like, the basis of writing a humorous book about the history of sex. And I think for me, I very much wanted it to be a book that helped people. I think I still have a complicated relationship with sex and used to have an even more complicated relationship with it. And there are so many reasons why people might really benefit from like being surrounded with this very surprising collection of facts about sex and how they shouldn't feel bad about it and how whether they want to have it or don't want to have it or who they want to have it with, it's all probably really okay. And then in just writing that, I think the thing that I thought about the most while editing was just like, does this have the potential to to alienate someone. You know, it felt like, what was the point of me writing a book about how everything weird is normal and everything normal is weird if someone reading it might feel really othered and alienated and hurt. So to me, I just like that this book could not exist in the form I wanted it to if it was pushing anyone away, except like I definitely very openly made fun of Mike Pence in this book, but I don't, I think that's okay.
I think that's okay.
He's the only person I alienated in the text, so we're fine.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question about humor and what you do. Like you were talking and writing about subjects that are very sensitive and sometimes like shame-filled for people. And I'm just wondering if your use of humor is to make them feel more comfortable, or how you find that humor informs your work, because you're very funny.
Thank you. I try, hopefully not too hard. But yeah, for me, I think, you know, I am definitely one of those people who became funny because I was anxious. And
I feel that.
Yeah. It's like most comedians and many journalists who act like they're comedians. But so yeah, for me, it's like really second nature when talking about things that are a little uncomfortable to try to bring some levity. And especially with science writing, I really got into it, like I love to learn science and I love to tell people about science, but I didn't want to be a teacher in the traditional sense. I loved kind of like making people gasp and laugh and get upset and say, no, Rachel, it's not fun that hyenas give birth through their clitorises. But
think about that one a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually got my first like TikTok stitched video where like a teenage boy talked about how disgusting I was. It was because of, I think it was because of that. No, it was because of the crocodile dung birth control. I lied.
Oh.
But that did feel like a real badge of honor.
Yeah, you made
yeah.
it. Do you want to tell people about the crocodile dung birth control if they do?
Yeah, I could do a quick reading from that section if we want to.
You can read whatever section you want. I just I know you might have had a different one planned, so whatever floats your boat.
No, I think this one's good. Cool. So this is from chapter 8, Have We Always Used Birth Control? In which crocodile dung goes into some unspeakable places, Casanova loses all of your respect, and people sneeze semen everywhere. Contrary to what periodic peaks of moral outrage might have you believe, baby making has always been pretty low on our sexual to-do list. Don't believe me? Just ask the women from some 4,000 years ago who spent their days shoving crocodile dung up into their vaginas. As discussed in our chapter on reproduction, humans were blissfully unaware of the exact mechanics of human fertilization until the late 1800s, and didn't even spot sperm for the first time until 1677. But long before we'd begun to investigate the little swimmers that help us wriggle our way into existence, people got wise, relatively speaking anyway, to the fact that when two become one, they could then become three. We don't have any way of knowing when and how this became common knowledge. That's because the idea that sex and babies are linked is probably older than our own species. A hominid wouldn't need that much cognitive prowess to put two and two together, and communities were probably more successful when they told their kids that flagrant boning might leave them with another mouth to feed. In fact, it's likely that the first widely practiced method of birth control was simply breastfeeding, in a brilliant evolutionary bid to make sure mamas have enough resources to rear their young to maturity. Regular nursing triggers hormones about as effective as modern contraceptive pills, at least for the first 6 months. But for people who weren't interested in having even one kid or nursing them until they went off to college, the first evidence of effective birth control crops up in texts from ancient Egypt. Sometime between the realization that sex made babies and the earliest days of recorded history, folks decided semen was the thing to avoid. This was smart. If ejaculate can't make its way into the cervix, pregnancy can't happen. So Egyptian women in 1850 BC combined bits of honey, salt, and sometimes crocodile dung to create spermicidal plugs. The acidity of the poop and other ingredients, combined with the stickiness of the honey and the physical barrier of the plug itself, would have been fairly effective at blocking and killing sperm. Meanwhile, although we're not sure if they knew it at the time, the powerful antimicrobial properties of honey would have helped keep the gooey suppository from causing a dangerous infection. By the 1500s BC, ground up acacia leaves, which we now know produce lactic acid, which inhibits sperm motility, were a crucial component. Archaeologists have even found recipes for abortifacient concoctions inside ancient tombs, perhaps indicating that Egyptians counted on having a pretty freaky afterlife and didn't want any undead kids to put a damper on it. You may not quite buy that early humans knew how to harness breastfeeding as a contraceptive. Even so, the records of these theoretically effective Egyptian contraceptives, that makes almost 4,000 years of documented attempts to do the crime without doing the time. And we haven't stopped since. In 1997, psychologist Craig Hill set out to determine the most common motivating factors behind human sexual intercourse. He presented 8 typical motivations. Getting pregnant got ranked dead last. My favorite thing about the crocodile dung fact, whenever people ask me what my favorite or most surprising fact in the book was, I'm like, well, the crocodile dung suppositories are obviously like shocking. But the thing that surprised me is that when you think about the mechanics of it, it was like actually probably reasonably effective. And, you know, we see throughout history this like combination of physical cervical barrier and something to change the pH. And in fact, there's now one of the most recently approved new birth controls was the gel called Phexxi, which has a bunch of like very girl bossy Instagram ads about how like you don't need hormones, it's on demand birth control, baby, all natural. And it's you know, essentially a much more hygienic, clinically tested version of the crocodile dung, where it's changing the pH in there to make it less hospitable to sperm. And then meanwhile, as recently as the 20th century, you had people doing like Lysol douches, which was not effective, like probably less effective and definitely more dangerous. So, and you know, that wasn't because knowledge had been lost. It was because there were literally obscenity laws keeping people from advertising and selling reasonable folksy methods of birth control. So there's this real like gap you see, especially you know, in the US and Europe, between like when people were using folk contraceptives and abortifacients, and then when the pill came out, where people started using way more dangerous stuff because everything had to be kind of pushed underground. So I think it's so important to remember that we have this like real tendency to think of our ancestors as being like total bozos, and we've got everything figured out. And crocodile dung versus Lysol douching is just one example of how we are not just making a linear progression from being backwards to having all the answers.
Well, there's this like real sense that that the people who came before us were like not sex freaks. Like there's the idea that like, I think generationally, especially when people are younger, like the idea that like they're kind of discovering something for the first time, or like on like the negative side, that this thing about them is like shameful and they're alone in it. But from reading your book, it really brings home the idea that like, no, we've been freaky forever. We are freaks. Like this is what we do.
Yeah, no, humans are real sex freaks. And then, periodically, some political or religious power will decide, no, stop being sex freaks. And then we'll do that for a while. Or we'll just get really just twisted ideas about how to be only like the right amount of sex freak. I mean, I think the like medieval policing of married sexuality is really interesting to think about, because there's a time obviously when you were not supposed to have sex outside of marriage, but then there were also all these rules about how you could have sex within marriage, because the paradigm became marriage exists solely to create this one scenario where God is okay with people boning, and that when they can conceive children. So you could get in trouble if it just turned out that you were like having sex more often than it seemed like was necessary to like reasonably reproduce. And on the flip side, I talk about how in, I think the 1400s, might be slightly off on that, but one of the only ways a woman could get a divorce is if she proved that her husband was impotent, because he couldn't waste a marriage with his inability to impregnate her. And they had to have like trusted old matrons from the town, like spend a certain number of nights with them to prove that he was, which I feel like is really, it seems like really that was unlikely to ever go in the guy's favor. But to be fair, they only got to do that after like 2 years of the woman insisting he was impotent and her character references, because obviously the assumption was that the woman was lying, maybe a witch, but once you got to that point, then the final step was having a bunch of old ladies watch your husband not get an erection at your house. And this is real. They're court documents.
Oh, wow.
So sometimes humans are so obsessed with not being sex freaks that we do some pretty freaky stuff.
Hey, I was like, that's very freaky stuff.
Yeah.
People pay a lot of money for that experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, so I was thinking about like, something that your book does so well is just there's like a really refreshing frankness and excitement that perfuses the book. And it's so radically different than the sex ed I got in high school. You and I, it turns out, have fairly similar church backgrounds as adolescents, which is a doozy unto itself. Oh my God. But just like how do you think the way sex ed works in America affects people as they grow up and try to figure out who they are and what they like?
Yeah, it's, it definitely doesn't help. And, there's such a, there are people, I think, who like the sex ed is actively harmful. Of course, we know that abstinence-only education does not work in preventing pregnancy. And a lot of that, there's obviously the kind of purity culture messaging you get in an actual church, but then there's a lot of sex ed where it's still really colored by purity culture. Like I had my one real sex ed experience at like a very large public high school with like a very sexually precocious student body. I think about the things my 14-year-old classmates talked about doing, and I think, oh no. But even there, where ostensibly our health teacher knew a lot of my classmates were having sex and like wanted us to do it safely, it was still like, if you have to, please use condoms and spermicide. We also had to watch a video that I think was produced by the Church of Latter-day Saints about a little boy with hemophilia getting AIDS. And I was like, this shouldn't be in sex ed. This is really, so anyway, I think even in the best of circumstances, a lot of how we talk about sex, there's so much stigma and, or even like really well-intentioned sex ed teachers, it can be like so medicalized where it's really focusing on like, we really don't want you to get STIs. And that's good. That's much better than abstinence only education. But I think, there's very little discussion of like desire and libido and like consent and communication with partners. That's all stuff that I don't think historically schools have thought it was their business or problem to teach. And of course now, like, teachers are under attack for, being at all open with their students about sexuality, which I think is incredibly harmful, of course. But yeah, I don't know how to fix sex ed. I guess just having Gillian Anderson's character from the Netflix show teach all children about sex. That's the best I've got.
I'm gonna write that one down, making a note. Rachel knows how to fix this. Yeah, so that brings me to my question of like, who, when you were researching this and writing this and conceiving of it, like who is the book for? Who was the book for in your mind then, and who is it for now? Like, how did that work for you?
Yeah, I definitely wrote it on some level for myself, not just like me before I became sexually active as a teenager, when like there was so much I could have been told that might have helped me protect myself, but also me like less than a decade ago in a very abusive relationship, and me like now in therapy for PTSD. Like I was very much writing the book that I needed to read. And I think also really, the one group that I cared about, like definitely liking the book, and I was like, if this demographic gets nothing from this book, then I really failed, were like teens and young adults who are aware that their sexual education had a lot of holes in it and are like curious. I mean, I've always felt like my humor as a science writer is really geared. It's not geared toward people who like think they hate science. It's geared toward people who like think science is fine, but have no idea how much they're going to love science. And like, I was writing this book for people who are that way about not necessarily having sex, like if they want to, great, but like the topic, thinking about the weirdness of bodies and evolution and reproduction, and just really, I wrote this for people who have no idea how much kooky stuff there is to learn, and hopefully I succeeded with that.
Well, I mean, it's such a delight because, to go from a very like rigid, like early elementary school binary idea of like the two sexes, and then you learn about a wood fungus that has tens of thousands of sexes, and you're just like, oh, maybe we didn't get this quite. We got it right-ish. It's cool that it's right-ish, but there's a lot more to it than just this, like,
yeah,
the strict binary idea of how this works. And, I loved early in the book when you talk about like, well, okay, how did sex happen? Like, when did that start? And I was just like, oh my God, I don't think I've ever considered that.
Well, speaking of like evangelical upbringings, something that was in the book at some very early draft or proposal phase and didn't quite make it through was that I was like, when I was like 14, which is when I was like really like on the precipice of being like, what do I think about things? But I remember thinking like when Adam and Eve had sex for the first time, that must have been upsetting for everyone involved. Like, and obviously, I no longer think of the beginning of sex as being, in that biblical moment, but I never really stopped having that question in the back of my mind of being like, it's a weird thing to do. So it's a chicken and egg question that I think we don't talk enough about, like, when did sex become a thing that happens? And of course, it being a long genital limbed bony fish named M. Dickey was just a thrilling surprise, not something I knew going in.
I could not believe the name on that was not related
I know
to its role in sexual evolution.
I hope Robert Dick is smiling down on us. I doubt it. I think he's probably rolling in his grave, but
well, yeah, I just love that you are not scared of messy answers, messy questions. I feel like in certain types of science writing, or people might feel compelled to give like a clean answer, a digestible understand. Like, it's not that your work isn't understandable and like holistic, but it doesn't land on like one point. And I wonder, is it hard for you to tackle those messy questions and feel like you are imparting to us the mess, but also the clarity in it?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, I don't understand how anyone poses any question as not being messy.
That's the spirit.
My brain is a pretty chaotic place. But yeah, I think, I really went into this book very firm in the knowledge that I am not an expert in this topic. I am very good at absorbing and synthesizing information. And so I think that, maybe in some ways was really helpful in writing a book about such a messy topic, because I really wasn't coming in with a lot of preconceptions about like, this is I think there are a lot of nonfiction books out there that are like, we found the answer to this long question. And, often those books are presenting really valid answers. We have found to valid questions, but that was very much not this book. I was like, we have no idea what's going on. We've learned a lot. And I would like more people to understand just how complicated human bodies are and evolution is and sex is. So yeah, it was very much like the point of the book going in was to present to people that this is all a lot messier than they've been told. And the one like point that I cared about being really clear was like, and that's good. That's like, that's great. That means that everything you've been told is really clear cut is actually just like something someone made up. So go be free.
There's freedom in mess.
Yes. Yeah.
Cat. Cat wants to be it. This is Larry, and she's a
Larry.
I'm not paying enough attention. Yeah, the message that like mess is good and that mess is normal, and mess is okay has been really helpful to me personally over the course of my life. And it's something that I try to put into my own work. And I really respect how easy you make it look, to be honest. You're very good at it.
Thank you.
Let's see. I have like one more question and then we'll get to audience questions. And I just want to know, like, when you think back on the things that you put into the book and that you learned, what were some facts that made you just go, Barry, that's my microphone. Such a pail. What were some things that made you just go like, oh?
Well, so I mean, in my chapter on masturbation, I talk a lot about like Victorian era anti-masturbation devices, and those, some of them were pretty wild, but I knew those existed before.
Mm-hmm.
What I hadn't really stared at before writing this book were the precursors to IUDs that were sometimes like fully like a blown glass pessary that had parts that existed both on the inside and the outside of the cervix, and metal ones too, which of course was very effective, but also very bad. You don't want you don't want that. You don't want things that are both outside and inside your body, and the cervix is a spot where you can mess that up if you let a doctor put a piece of glass in there. So looking at those really upset me. I really need to kind of put my head between my knees.
Do the breathing.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, another thing, less just like gross out and more just like, why didn't I know this before? Was the fact that, when abortion laws were first put into place in the US, it was pretty clearly a push from the American Medical Association to delegitimize midwives and other female health practitioners, to delegitimize folk medicine and other ways that people could get care without going to an OB/GYN, because that field was very new. And the guy who's kind of considered the father of obstetrics, Horatio Robinson Storer, was very, very anti-abortion, possibly truly on like a moral, personal level, but whatever his real motivations were, it's now pretty widely accepted by historians that the reason the American Medical Association like got behind his crusade and got abortion outlawed was because they saw the opportunity to, it was basically like a marketing tactic. And that made me so angry. It didn't surprise me, but I was like, how have I never read about this? And it's not that there aren't people writing about it. I did not discover this fact. It is just out there, but it's just, it's something that I think a lot of people just kind of treat as like a footnote. And yeah, abortion is probably as old as humanity. And we see that it was, very common throughout history. And the partisanship of it, it being treated as a political and a religious issue, is really new and can really be traced to mostly this one guy. And again, that just like really blew my mind. So now I tell as many people as I can about that.
Yeah, it's a pretty devastating, it's somehow unsurprising fact.
Yes. Yeah. Lots of more fun ones in the book too, though. I promise. Most of them are silly.
Well, if it's time for the Q&A, thank you both. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
There is a question already here from Abby, and should anyone else have questions, please type them in the Q&A box or in the chat. That works too. All right, Abby asks, what is your favorite fact that you didn't include in the book?
That is such a great question. There definitely are things that, like, basically once a week since I submitted the final manuscript of the book, I either come across a new thing or remember something that I meant to put in. When you're doing a book that's like just a collection of facts, it's not like a long narrative, like so much of it was me just being like, I sure hope I remember this thing at the right moment. Also, just I wouldn't recommend writing a book during a pandemic, not your first one. I need to develop some better processes. But anyway, the one thing that comes to mind as something that didn't end up fitting in the book, but that I love, was something I've talked about on the Weirdest Thing I Learned This Week before, which is that Nikola Tesla claimed to have never had sex, thought that not ejaculating was the source of his intelligence, and was deeply in love with a pigeon. He wrote that he loved her as a man loves a woman. And when she died, he said he knew that his life's work had come to a close. And I love that story. There's a great, actually, contemporary opera about that story that my sister Chelsea Feltman has performed before. I think it's just called Tesla's Pigeon. And just the more I researched it, to like, it almost ended up in like the kinks chapter, but Tesla was very much not neurotypical. And as much as I wanted to gently and lovingly roast him for being in love with a pigeon, he was pretty sad by the end of his life. And I was like, this doesn't fit in a story about like, you know, a chapter about weird sex stuff. This is more of a sad and beautiful story about a very misguided and lonely man and his love for a bird. But I do love that he loved that pigeon. So, you know, maybe my next book, actually probably my next book. I said that as kind of a joke, but I'm like, no, that is actually going to be my next book.
Oh, that's great. That's great. You were talking earlier about, you know, people finding wonder around them, and I get that being part of why you love science communication. And I feel that way about pigeons. I love pigeons. Like anyone who goes on a walk in a city with me has to hear me talk about them. And I try to convert everyone to my pigeon love. So if you ever want to walk with me, we're going to talk about pigeons.
I hope to, truly.
Let's see. Do we have any more questions?
I got DM'd a question from an anonymous audience member who's asking, what are some other sexual traits in the animal kingdom that we typically think are just human characteristics?
Yeah, I mean, so there are so many. There are lots of animals that seem to have sex for pleasure. The ones that I talk about the most in my book are bonobos, because you know, we often hear that chimps are our closest evolutionary relatives, which is true, but there are actually two kinds of chimp that are equally related, and they are, you know, divided by, I think, a mountain range and a river and some time. But there's the common chimp that everybody knows, that everybody loves to talk about how they're humans' closest relatives because they like do wars and like eat children. They're like very violent, and so people are always like, yes, our base instincts in the chimp are brothers in the wild. And then you have bonobos who are equally related to us, and they have a matriarchy. They ostracize juvenile males who bully other members of the group, and they also masturbate a lot and have a lot of sex, gay sex, straight sex. They'll have sex facing each other sometimes, which is considered a very human thing. Researchers were surprised to find that. They'll like French kiss each other. They just like, they love doing it even more than we do, perhaps, or at least are more open. And they solve like all of their societal problems with it too. And it's not to say that I think that's how society should work, but I think we often go to chimp, not enough bonobo. And yeah, similarly, like in the book, I talk about a lot of the like same-sex sexual behavior that we see in non-human animals, and how one of the common theories for why that exists in particular animals is that it is a great social strategy to be open to having sex with anyone you meet. Like it is can really diffuse a situation, fix end a fight, smooth over territory dispute. So yeah, we also see in animals like bison and bats are the ones that immediately come to mind, but we see a lot of that kind of like same-sex sexual behavior as like a social act, a way to kind of like keep things friendly. Because what could keep things friendlier than having some sex? Yeah.
Well, Rachel, Leigh, thank you both so much. This has been such a fascinating event, such a wonderful evening, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. You can order Been There, Done That, and Hort's So Good from Northshire Bookstore at the links in the chat, or on our website, northshire.com. You can find them. We'll see you at another Northshire event soon. And Rachel, Leigh, again, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much for having me. Congratulations, Rachel.
Thank you, Leigh.
Have a great evening, guys.
You too.
Bye.